Welcome back to General Ecology. We're talking about community structure. Getting into this segment into a little bit on diversity and what drives communities to be more or less diverse. And specifically in this little sub-segment, going to talk about keystone species and how they impact diversity as well as trophic interactions. So without further ado, let's move on. Here's keystone species. It's a definition. The trick here is, where's this keystone concept come from? It's a great venue in San Francisco for hearing music, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is a keystone, and there's an arched architectural structure here, and to hold that arch up, you have to have a keystone that keeps it all together. If you pull that out, the whole thing collapses. That's the concept here. And in a community with a keystone, yeah, it's holding everything together. There aren't a lot of these bricks, if you will, in this structure. There's only one. So they're usually low number species, low abundance, but they have huge impacts on the community. Okay. And here's an example. I've already shown some other data with this story in line or in play, but the idea is that these mussels are holding everything down as a single species. And where do, that is the intertidal zone shellfish, if the keystone is around, the species numbers are pretty high, up around 20, even higher. But if you remove the keystone, one species dominates and takes over, and that would be the mussels. So in the presence of the starfish, lots of different species, barnacles, limpets, there's some sea anemones down here and things like that, some various alga, I won't call them kelp. But remove those sea stars, which are constantly opening up space and causing disturbance and free zones to get established. Then it becomes a crowded mussel bed, right? Okay. Here's another keystone that I'm sure most of you are already thinking about. And in this case, the beaver is an engineer, so we call these guys keystone engineers. We should call ourselves a keystone engineer because what beavers are doing is changing the habitat completely and making it better for the beaver. And if humans don't do that, I don't know what malls are. Okay, so we are, and in our houses and everything else, we are keystone engineers on the planet beyond anything that a beaver ever dreamed of. Okay, another thing that, well, I should finish with this idea that the stream is converted to a pond and you get a very different group of species that wind up getting established in that pond. And in fact, over time, you have a buildup of minerals and sediment back here, excuse me, and you will basically start seeing a successional sequence of plants behind that beaver dam. Okay, very different system. And the stream has one group of species, the pond has another, so diversity goes up combining the two. Trophic cascades also impact diversity, or maybe more to the point here is the numbers of the different species in the different trophic levels. And so we have two different kinds of control in these trophic cascades. Now, trophic is energy. Cascade is kind of going from point 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, moving up or down a series of steps, cascades. Trophic meaning energy. Okay. So bottom-up control says that if you have fewer phytoplankton, think of this as grass if you wish, or any kind of fodder for a cow or herbivore, deer, things like that, rabbits. Fewer of these will support fewer primary consumers that eat them, rabbits, chipmunks, things like that. Fewer primary consumers reduces the number of secondary consumers that can eat those. So these could be fox or maybe even coyote, and then you move up to, I've seen dioramas and evidence, I suppose, that red-tailed hawks, golden eagles can pick off foxes. So tertiary consumers. The fish example is a little bit easier to envision because we don't really see the difference other than size between the secondary consumers and the tertiary. So out in the deep sea, though, we're talking tuna versus salmon, perhaps. Okay, hope I didn't get myself in trouble there. I think that would be okay to use those examples. If you had more primary consumers, then you can have, producers, green things, then you can have more primary consumers, more secondary consumers, more tertiary consumers. And so this is bottom-up control. The more in this baseline you have, the more producers you have, the more up the trophic cascade, the more energy can flow up the trophic cascade, and at each level you get more individuals. Very different than top-down, which is also happening. So if you have fewer tertiary consumers, that releases the secondary consumers. They're not getting eaten as much, okay? And therefore, they're eating more of the primary consumers, which releases the producers. And there are more, this is kind of called the green earth hypothesis. The earth is green. Obviously, it's blue because of water, but the terrestrial setting is green because of the green plants, because there are fewer consumers eating the green plants, because there are more secondary consumers eating the primary consumers, etc. Okay. If you have more tertiary consumers, then they eat the secondary consumers, which then now releases the primary consumers, which then now eat the herbs or the phytoplankton and things like that. And this example in the aquatic system for top-down control and bottom-up actually bears out pretty well with lots of good experimental data. The trick is I have seen people arguing which was more important, bottom-up or top-down. I strongly suggest both are happening, and we ought not to get all excited about our version that makes more sense. Kind of depends on where you are. It's just like how do you define a community, right? All right, that's bottom-up, top-down trophic cascades. Here's some real data that were manipulated. The system was manipulated to look at this interaction between bottom-up and top-down. Phytoplankton biomass, they're looking at micrograms of chlorophyll per liter on the y-axis from 0.1 up to, looks like it was 1,000 micrograms. And then the zooplankton biomass in micrograms of biomass, micrograms. And that's going from, again, 0 to 10 to 1 to 1,000 micrograms. Okay. As you add more phytoplankton on the x, you're adding more zooplankton that consume them on the y. And so this nice regression line is a diagonal, very nicely showing a relationship between phytoplankton moving right, zooplankton moving up. Now, if you add, this was in a system that had fish, take away the fish and, without the fish, it's the clear dots. Add the fish, the system shifts down to the right, okay? And so you start to have less chlorophyll because the fish are eating less of the primary consumers that are typically eating the chlorophyll, and things start to, the zooplankton get knocked down because of the fish, but that releases and moves the chlorophyll off to the right. And so you get more chlorophyll, okay? This is a figure that is no longer used in your text. Too bad. It's a little complicated, easy to get flipped up, but it makes a lot of sense if you look at it carefully. Now we move into something called, well, you've heard of these things, I'm sure. I had to learn them even in the Boy Scouts, right? Food chain and food web. And a food chain is a linear representation of the trophic interactions, of how things like energy move through the system. And one might, in this case, go from phytoplankton and bacteria up into the snail, to the heron, or to the water snake, and then up to the bald eagle. Let's go this way, okay? You can imagine these food chains, but they don't occur in isolation, just like everything we've been talking about. They occur in multiple complex food chains with lots of interlinkages between them and therefore food web is probably a more apt description of what's going on there. Again, the arrows indicate consumption of movement and movement of energy, or sometimes nutrients. Sometimes it's a food web that looks at, say, nitrogen flow or something like that. Okay. And this is an interesting food web that I think, and trophic interactions that I think is increasingly being demonstrated, if you will, and that is the impact of the aquatic system on the terrestrial. Most of us focus in on just the aquatics or just the terrestrials, okay? But it turns out there's interplay between those two systems. Not in every single species trophic interaction, but in some key places, it's actually pretty important. So looking at this figure, let's build up on it. You have a fish here that has a negative line, direct negative impact on larvae of the dragonfly. So they're eating the dragonfly, okay? The dragonfly larvae have a positive impact on adult dragonfly. If there are larvae, you'll have more adults in the system, okay? But when the fish is there, you'll have less because the fish is eating the larvae. So you get less adults with the fish present. But then look at this. You have a positive, now the dashed lines are indirect. So there's an indirect effect on the adults because this fish is eating the larvae. There's an indirect positive effect on pollinators because the adults eat the pollinators. So if the fish is eating the dragonfly larvae, you're getting fewer adults, and therefore you get more more pollinators, bees. And because of that, the fish is having a indirect positive effect on the flowering plants nearby because with more bees, you have more seed set. Okay, it's a very complicated, it's actually a very simple model. You just have to slow down and walk through all those direct and indirect effects. And here's a cartoon I drew just to re-emphasize everything I just said in the next slide. Well, oh, sorry, these are the data that the researchers collected, and then the book uses them, showing you the number of pollinator visits when you have fish in the nearby pond versus no fish. And you have far fewer visits to the flowers, less pollination, less seed set, if you have fish getting rid of the predator of the pollinators, essentially. Without fish, not as many pollinators, not as much seed set was the rest of that story. And so here is sort of the trophic cascade concept again, but also showing you the linkages. So we have fish, which are the aquatic predators. We have dragonflies, which are aquatic prey for the fish in the larval form, as well as aerial predators on the pollinator in the aerial form, the adult form. We have pollinators and we have St. John's wort seed set. So without fish, that releases the dragonflies. The dragonflies start eating more of the pollinators, and the pollinators start or cannot pollinate the St. John's wort, and you have fewer seed setting. If you do have fish in the system, then they eat the dragonfly larvae, which means there will be fewer predators in the air, the adults, which means you'll have better pollinators and more pollination and more seed set, right? Pretty straightforward arrow. Ecologists love these arrows. We loved arrows. It goes from this to that. We'll get into this a little bit more when we do ecosystem work. Okay, jump into yet another big topic here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, cool. Because I'm almost done for this chapter. So mathematical models, we've been talking about these a lot in different ways, but mathematical models for community stability and diversity suggest, and real-world examples suggest, that the more diverse community you have, the higher the species richness, the more stable that community is, the more resilient that community is, and the ability to avoid massive perturbations to send the system into a new location in ecological space, if you will. It's believed that species richness prevents that, or at least reduces the effects of perturbations and such, that the community is more stable with more diversity. A good example that I used to use when I taught at a summer camp, you get a string, some of you I'm sure have done this, ball of string, and you give it to a kid, and then you walk it out. You get everybody in a circle, and you walk it out and give it to the next kid, and then you walk it out and give it to another kid, and you just keep doing that. And you show that with one connection between each of the kids, it's not so stable. You could put a weight on there and it'll kind of collapse. But if you then start repeating those connections and have some kids with lots of interactions, some kids accepting lots of interactions, many doing both, put a heavy weight on there like a rock, and it's pretty stable. So it's a nice example of this idea. More species increases the stability, and the more connections you have between those species, which kind of falls in line with the more species. Okay, mathematical models demonstrate that. Good, smart people have shown it. And real-world examples demonstrate that. Good, smart people have shown it. But really smart people have also shown that mathematical models can predict, and there are real-world examples of extremely low diversity with great stability. Communities with real low diversity and great stability. So once again, in ecology, we're left with this idea that, well, if you're frustrated with ecology, you say, these guys don't know what the heck they're talking about. Or you say, it really depends, and you have to get in there and understand your community to understand how these interactions play out and if it is truly stable or not. And I would recommend that you take these lessons with you. Don't just go in to a system or a conversation and say, I've got this all figured out, boom, and then you could get into some trouble. The trick is to, and scientists are terrible about this, so I guess I'm in this mode. You get into this trouble where the people that are listening to you say you don't know what you're talking about, and actually you know more than anybody else in the room. And you know so much, as some philosophers have said, the more I know, the less I'm willing to share, because I don't actually know everything anymore. The more I know, the less I understand. I think that's the quote I was looking for. So that is it for community structure. I do have one last slide that kind of summarizes the chapter. We've covered all these ideas. I hope you would agree. There are boundaries in communities, distinct and or non, or gradual. Gleason and Clements, I love asking graduate students to give me a reason why they support one or the other. Both are reasonable and strong ideas, or have reasonable and strong ideas, but may not apply everywhere you go. Diversity of a community incorporates both the number and the abundances, unless you're just looking at species richness. And abundance is important. You could have a very non-abundant species, by the way. Can you think of one? It's in the next little bullet. A keystone. A keystone species is not very abundant, but it is driving the stability of the system. It has a huge functional role. And so don't get confused by abundance and saying, you know, we don't need to pay attention to the rare species because they're not important. Wrong. They could be at the end of their range where you're doing your study, and they don't have as big an influence as those that are right in the middle of their range. But they could also be right in the middle of their range and hugely important. It's just that they have a role that doesn't require big numbers. I suppose beaver would be in that group. And then remember that communities are organized into food webs. I kind of bypassed the trophic cascades and food chains, but that leads to much more complex food webs. And aquatic systems are really interesting to be looking at food webs. Same with terrestrial, but I think a little less work is being done there. Although there was a professor here that used to look at the food webs and such in compost microinvertebrates. Bet you didn't know about that. All right, so that's it for today's segment. We'll see you next time. If you want to read up before we get there, we're going to look at succession, plant succession. We're going to come back to Clements, because he had a profound and excellent impact on our understanding of how succession works. Cheers. Thank you. We'll see you next time.